Okay, we'll get going. We broached the very, very large topic of language last day. There we noted that language seems to have at least a dual purpose, that is, we use it for communication, but it seems to play an important role in whatever we mean by thought or cognition as well. It was really interesting, and it explains why language has become such an important topic in cognitive science and in the theory of mind since the middle of the 20th century. We also looked a little bit at the evolution of language, and we found that there was very little evidence to go on. And it's very hard to know how language developed and what happened to our species. It's a question we'll come back to next week or on Thursday a little bit. One thing that we ruled out was the idea that there's a gene for language, and we followed that little story of FOXP2 as far as it went, but there is not and will not be a simple genetic story about language. And language is a very, very, very rich topic that can be approached in many ways. And today we're going to take an orthodox, academic, linguistic approach to language. How many people have ever taken a course in linguistics? One. Ooh. Okay, well, a lot of what we're going to say is new. Well, if you study linguistics formally, it's typically done within a specific framework which emerged really in the second half of the 20th century. And we're going to look at the subfields, as it were, your core topics that you would take if you were studying language in a linguistics department. And what we'll see is that this doesn't exhaust the questions we might have about language at all. It identifies a particular set of concerns, and they each have their interesting facets. So we'll be taking through these 6 subfields of linguistics. And I want to make one thing very, very clear. We'll be starting with pragmatics, which has something to do with meaning. And we'll be ending with phonetics, which has something to do with sound. Neither of those belongs to generative linguistics. Generative linguistics is a hugely abstract field that developed in the middle of the 20th century. And when we shift from pragmatics to semantics, we'll be entering that abstract domain. And we'll be there as we study semantics and its understanding of meaning, syntax, the cold heart of linguistics, morphology, that's as far as we're going to get today, phonology, which is sound within generative linguistics, and then we're going to drop back out into the real world. So, pragmatics and phonetics are deeply connected with the real world. There, our interest will be in specific communicative situations with real people in particular contexts interacting for particular purposes. In semantics, syntax, morphology, and phonology, we will be taking a much more abstract view in which language doesn't care whether it's spoken or written, for example. That's a real act of abstraction. And the codes involved will have names like English and French and Spanish. Pragmatics and phonetics are separate. We'll just start going down here. But first, before we do this, let's just see how this particular situation arose. When we study language, should we be studying speech or should we be studying writing? They're clearly related. Speech is not the same thing as language, but we'll come back to their relationship later. There's a huge array of phenomena here that one might choose to study. And collectively, they have something to do with the creation of the human life world. So we have a deep interest in understanding these. But the boundaries of what we consider to be language or linguistic are always contested and under revision. And any science of language can only sort of address some of the questions we might have. Now, if we go back to the 19th and 18th and earlier centuries, there's a lot of expertise in language studies. There's a lot of people who have taken great care to amass a great deal of very specific knowledge, usually about texts and that's the discipline of philology. It's not a scientific discipline, but it's a very important domain of expertise, and it goes on today, to this day. It was around the turn of between the 19th and 20th century that the science of language really emerged. So a little later than psychology. And we'll see that we can divide the 20th century more or less into two halves. The first half is concerned with a field known as structural linguistics, and that sort of got the game going. But then there was a big change and a shift in concerns and interests in the second half as we move into generative linguistics. And this by no means exhausts the study of language. So just a few words to philology. There's lots and lots of reasons that you might have the desire to develop expertise in texts. Interpreting religious texts, for example, is a very important business. It has gone on in very many societies. Biblical scholars care greatly about aligning Hebrew and Greek sources, for example. And that requires a great deal of expertise, not scientific expertise, but expertise nonetheless. Teaching people languages that are not their first language has always been a task, but the reasons we've done that have changed over time. So these days, you hop on a Ryanair flight and you end up in a half an hour and you're somewhere where they don't speak your language. So it's useful to learn foreign languages, and you learn Spanish and Italian and French and German and Polish and so on. But that's relatively recent because such travel is relatively recent. It used to be much harder to get to what we call the continent. But for a couple of hundred years before that, it was presumed that it was worth your while learning Latin and Greek. These were languages of scholarship. So the business of teaching people languages that are not their native language has been around for a long time, but the purposes have changed, and the way in which it's done has changed greatly. And there's a great deal of expertise in studying texts of various kinds, legal texts, literature, and so on. And while none of this is hardcore scientific work, it's all extremely interesting and has contributed greatly to our understanding of how we use language. But then, around the turn of between the 19th and 20th century, we get this emergence of a discipline which became known as structural linguistics. And it's frequently associated with the name of Ferdinand de Saussure, who was a Swiss scholar. And he had a great organizing intellect. And what was happening here was entirely in the spirit of 19th century science, late 19th century science, which was to bring together a whole bunch of observations, findings, and to put some theoretical bones on them, to organize them, and to look for systematicities, to look for regularities that will make things clearer, that will give you the sense that something has been explained or understood. Now, everyday language use is kind of messy. We often don't speak in sentences. There, I just started. Look, none of these are sentences. They're sort of half sentences. That's typically the way that we speak. And we speak differently in different contexts, and we don't necessarily adhere to any rules. So identifying underlying regularities is already a process of abstraction. And de Saussure lifted off the messy business of everyday spoken interaction in order to identify systematic organization, in his case primarily in the domain of sound. And while the organizing framework that he put in place has remained with us and has proved very, very useful, even as linguistics itself has changed. So structural linguistics was quite innovative. And we can get a sense for this by comparing these two tables. Down here on the right, you see the periodic table of the elements. And if you've taken any chemistry class, this is bread and butter for chemists. This is how we organize our knowledge of chemistry. And it's a magnificent work of abstraction that captures a whole bunch of systematic regularities and that makes clear how otherwise disparate things are related to each other. So the organization of the rows and the columns is not accidental at all. They vary systematically in properties, in physical properties, in chemical reactive properties. And the systematic organization is so well organized, so complete, that it has been possible to predict the existence of elements that have never been encountered. So there's a great deal of insight that gave rise to this table, and it has stood the test of time. And while this is not linguistics, it's evident that this is the systemic organization and abstraction characteristic of late 19th century science that helped to bring a sense of command to specialists in a particular domain. I want to point out that the periodic table bears a lot of similarity to the table up on the top left. This was also a product of the late 19th century, although this is a modern version of it. And this is the organizing of sound contrasts, in this case consonants, consonantal sound contrasts, not of any given language, but of all language. The idea is that languages, spoken languages, have to be manifested in vocal tracts that are more or less the same the world over. So there's a certain kind of set of contrasts that each language is free to make use of, and no language is going to make use of them all. No language features all these contrasts. English sounds are here, so p, b is quite a familiar distinction to every English speaker. The sounds here are organized from top to bottom by the manner in which they are articulated. That is, the form of movement in the vocal tract that gives rise to them. At the top we have stops or plosives, where you close off the airflow and then release it. P. As we go down, we get different manners. So the next row are nasals, where you have airflow through the nose. And then later on we have fricatives, where you've got turbulence. And as we go from left to right, the place in the vocal tract where the constriction is changes. From the very front, p and b, I make the constriction at the lips, but I can go back to a t, d, or further back to a k, g, and further back to in the throat to a, using my voice, my vocal cords to make the obstruction. So this is a systematic organization, and its goal, which was not quite as successful as the periodic table, was to capture all possible sound contrasts in all possible languages. So you can see the systemic organization, the abstraction, and the attempt to organize a domain of knowledge here that's so typical of late 19th century science. And this particular enterprise gave rise to what we call structuralism, which was a revolution in the human and social sciences. The idea being that stuff of everyday human life could be seen to represent underlying abstract systems, well-organized systems, found favor in many disciplines, not just in linguistics. In anthropology, for example, people gleefully turned to this and started looking at kinship systems, looking at, around here you might describe various people you're related to as your brothers, your sisters, your cousins, your aunts and uncles, brother-in-law, father-in-law. That set of relations, they're cast differently in different societies, but the idea was that, like the organization of sounds in a language, there might be a fundamental systematicity to it, so that each culture would be choosing from a finite set of possible oppositions. It found use in the social sciences, even in psychoanalysis. Structuralism, in other words, brought the sciences and the humanities much closer together in ways that are still having huge knock-on effects. But we're going to leave Saussure there and move to the second half of the 20th century, where, as we're very familiar now, there was a huge intellectual revolution. We had the introduction of the computer metaphor, the language of information processing, and a whole bunch of concepts that were not freely available beforehand, the distinction between software and hardware, and above all, the development of the computational theory of mind, in which formal links between language and thought were made, and each were seen as being concerned with the rule-based organization of symbols that can be manipulated according to rules. This is all drawing from the computational vocabulary. We've met this before. We met Chomsky's early work where he critiqued the book Verbal Behavior by Skinner, claiming that the behaviorist approach that viewed language as a set of acquired habits was incapable of dealing with many obvious features of natural language. One is that children pick it up really, really quickly on the basis of very scant evidence. So children seem to be born ready to learn language in a way that a behaviourist account couldn't account for. And secondly, to regard language production as habitual makes no sense when most sentences are entirely novel constructions. You cannot learn by habit how to be entirely creative and novel all the time. Chomsky's particular concern was with syntax, which we will be looking at. Syntax has to do with what rule-based orderings of words are permissible within one language that make a particular set of words grammatical and another set ungrammatical. This notion of grammar is a syntactic notion, which we'll be looking at a little bit more closely. You can't separate this development in linguistics from the more general development of that sees the information revolution and cognitive psychology. So it's with this generative linguistics that we're concerned as we move from pragmatics into semantics. That's where it starts. Semantics, syntax, morphology, and phonology. These were concerns of the structuralists and of the generativists, and in each case they represent a huge abstraction in which language is considered independent of modality, so we don't care whether it's spoken or written, and independent of the context of use, so we don't care who's speaking or writing to whom, when, and for what purposes. But we're going to start in the real world, and on Thursday we'll get back to the real world as we fall back out into phonetics. So let's start with pragmatics, which is not part of generative linguistics. The philosopher of language, Ludwig Wittgenstein, grappled deeply with the question of how do you characterize meaning? How can you understand the relationship between words and world? And he tried very, very hard all his life, and his views changed. He gave up ultimately in trying to map from words to world, as if a given set of words had a particular meaning in the world. And he finally came to the position that if you want to understand what a word means, you just have to look at where it's used, how it's used, why it's used, by whom it's used, and what happens when the word is used. So language as use. This is a very pragmatic sort of approach to language, and in pragmatics we're interested not in abstractions, we're interested in purposes, we're interested in why words are said in a particular context, and what the purposes are with which they're said. What are people trying to do when they use words? Now that's a different question than asking how do words map onto the world. We're asking what do people want to achieve when they use words. So if someone asks you, you're at dinner and someone says, can you pass the salt? And you say yes, and you don't pass the salt, you're doing it wrong, right? That's not how language works. Clearly, if someone says, can you pass the salt, they're not asking you to literally interpret their words. They're trying to get you to pass the salt. And as a language user, you know this. You know this full and well. So pragmatics has to do with this business of intentions. And so we won't be trafficking in rules so much as norms. And when we look at any given conversation, what we find is the conversation is structured according to norms, but not really rules. Now, what would you call a rule that you're free to break? So we think of rules as being something that you shouldn't break. But we need a word for a rule that you can break, but if you break it, it means something. Well, we're going to use the word maxim here, and the philosopher Grice introduced a bunch of what he called conversational maxims, which draw on the fact that in every communicative situation, whenever we talk, cooperation is understood. Even if we're arguing, if we're disagreeing, if we're having a shouting match, there are still norms that structure the conversation that are understood, which is what it is to be a language user in the first place. So we're going to look at some of these unwritten norms. You can think of them as rules, but they're rules that you're free to break at any time. But every time you break them, there are consequences. So here are some of Grice's suggested conversational maxims. The maxim of truth says, don't say what you believe to be false. Now, obviously you can break that rule, right? You're all perfectly capable of telling a lie. But it would be entirely destructive of human social intercourse if you could not rely on people usually adhering to this. Imagine you go to the student union shop and you buy a sandwich, and you go up to the till and the person says, "That's $3.50, please." You don't go, "You're lying." You assume that they're telling the truth, right? And this is how things work. Someone comes in and says, "Oh man, it's raining buckets outside." You don't go, "Have you any evidence for that?" You assume that people are telling the truth because it would be wholly disruptive if people regularly... And when you, of course you can lie, but if you lie, if I recognize that you're lying, our conversation just changed, didn't it? It's now all about the lie. So when you flaunt one of these maxims, it changes the conversation. So don't say that for which you lack adequate evidence. If you interject into a conversation, adding some observation or some of your precious knowledge, we assume usually you know what you're talking about. And if it turns out that you don't know what you're talking about and that you're liable to jump into a conversation ignorantly, that's going to change the conversations that you're in. A maxim of quantity. Be as informative as required, but not more informative than required. You're all familiar with the problem of too much information. You ask someone, "How are you doing?" and you end up with a half-hour screed about their budgie died and their sock drawer is not ordered, and that's not how conversation is supposed to work. There's a sort of, in every conversational exchange, there's a carefully balanced requirement that you provide certain information, not withholding what's relevant, but not adding too much either. We can't write these rules out, we just know them as speakers. Be relevant, don't be obscure, avoid ambiguity, be brief, be orderly. You can break any of these. You can violate all these maxims, but every time you do so, it means something and it changes the nature of the conversation. So that gives you just a general sense of what the discipline of pragmatics is all about. It's about meaning in context. It's about the intentions of those who participate in dialogue. What are they trying to do, and how do they get things done using words? It's not about any abstract code, and it doesn't make sense to pursue the business of pragmatics without carefully attending to context. Where, when, why. And that's quite different. We're now going to descend into the rarefied realm of generative linguistics. To some extent, pragmatics is about meaning. But it's a particular kind of meaning. It's usage meaning. There's a discipline in generative linguistics which is also concerned with meaning, and that's semantics. But this is going to take a completely different approach to what it is to mean anything. We will now be considering sentences independent of their context. Sentences that are not uttered or written by anybody, they're just sentences. So take these sentences: "All Dubliners are not dumb." It differs in interesting ways from the sentence, "Not all Dubliners are dumb." Specifically, if I say all Dubliners are not dumb, when you go out and you find a Dubliner who is dumb, my sentence is false. But the second one, "not all Dubliners are dumb," is only false unless every single Dubliner turns out to be dumb. So the conditions that make them true or false differ between these sentences. Notice we introduced the notion of true or false. That means that we're dealing now with correspondences between words and world. That was not the case in pragmatics. Pragmatics was concerned with getting things done. Here we're dealing with presumed correspondences between words and world. A very abstract notion and problematic one. We can do this not only at the level of sentences, we can do this at the level of individual words. So we can ask of words, take the words student and pupil. Clearly they have related meanings. In what sense are they related? Do they overlap? Well, those are interesting because if you go to a primary school and you start speaking of the attendees as students, it's a bit odd. We usually call them pupils. But if I call you guys pupils, you'll be offended. Quite rightly, because this is most definitely not a primary school. But if we go to a secondary school, we find a little bit of variation here. Sometimes the word pupil, sometimes the word... So there's overlap in secondary school between student and pupil. So they're not quite the same, but they have overlapping fields. That's the kind of relationship that semantics can inquire into. And many of these approaches use the tools of formal logic. Here are some examples for just to take one deep dive. These are relationships that can obtain between words. So not sentence level, but word level meanings. So we saw that pupil and student have overlapping meanings, but they also have differences. An extreme example of overlap is given by sofa and couch. I don't think there's an example of something which is a sofa and it's not a couch. Every sofa is a couch, every couch is a sofa. So those are, in some respects, synonyms. They seem to have the same meaning. Notice you could approach the question of sofas and couches very differently. You could probably find differences in different populations. Protestants might use sofa more often than Catholics who use couch, or vice versa, I don't know. I haven't done the study. My point is, because two words exist, doesn't mean that everybody uses them interchangeably. Some of you are scone people and some of you are scone people, some of you are sofa people and some of you are couch people. But from the abstract perspective of semantics, they are synonyms, they have the same meaning. And we can find the other relationship, antonyms, when two words have opposite meanings. So up and down have opposite meanings. Light and dark have opposite meanings. What's the opposite of train? There is no opposite of train. Not all words have opposites, right? But certain word pairs have opposites. And that's the relationship of antonymy. Polysemous words are words where there's one word that has multiple meanings. So an example of this is chip. If you go down to the chipper and you order a bag of chips and a battered sausage, that sense of chip is actually related to the sense in which your computer has a silicon chip inside. Because in both cases, we're dealing with a thin slice off a larger unit. The silicon chip is a slice off a silicon block. The chip in the chipper is a slice off a potato. But the words are related. So we have one word, multiple meanings. That's a polysemous word. And we can differentiate that from the apparently similar situation of a word like bank. Now, we can use the word bank to refer to the side of a river. And we can use the word bank to refer to the place where you keep your money. But if we follow those back, they do not have a common meaning. They don't come from a common origin. They are, as it were, two separate words that just happen to look alike. So we call those homonyms. Those kinds of relationships are semantic relationships. In a specific domain, like the domain of shapes, a polygon is a higher order construct which includes triangles and squares and hexagons and heptagons and nonagons. So there's lots and lots of types of polygons. So a triangle is a hyponym of a polygon. That is, it's a specification, it's a smaller set. It's one kind of polygon. And the polygon then is a hypernym of triangle. So those kinds of relationships are semantic relationships, and that's what the discipline of semantics is dealing with. Quite different from pragmatics, although both study something related to meaning in a broad sense. Now we're going to drop down into the core of generative linguistics. This was Chomsky's field, which is syntax. And the big startling claim, really, that emerged from Chomsky's work was that you can discuss syntax, which has to do with sequences of words that are grammatical or ungrammatical. You can do so without reference to meaning. That is, that the rules that dictate which sequences of words belong to a language and which sequences of words do not have to refer to meaning. Words on this view come in different kinds. There's nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and a few more. And they combine in certain ways. Those are called parts of speech. And when we string them together, we can make larger order constituents called phrases. And we can string phrases together to make sentences. And some sentences can be transformed into other sentences by rearranging words. So if I say, I gave John the book, that has a clear relationship to a related sentence, which is, I gave the book to John. There's obviously important similarities between those. Chomsky did a strange thing here. In order to demonstrate that syntax can be pursued independently of meaning, he came up with this sentence, colourless green ideas sleep furiously. He claimed that this sentence is meaningless, but it's syntactically okay, so it's a grammatical sentence of English. I find his claim that this sentence is meaningless to be bizarre. In that case, every poem I've ever read is meaningless, and I don't think that's the case. This is, in other words, you can look at that as quite a poetic sentence. It's a challenge to meaning making. If meaning lies in the mind of the reader or the listener, then his claim is vacuous. But the way in which Chomsky is using the word meaning suggests that this is meaningless but grammatical. And grammatical here has a very particular meaning, a technical meaning in syntax that we need to attend to. So when we say grammar, we're talking about those underlying regularities that dictate which sequences of words can occur and not occur within a given language. So we're assuming that there's such a thing as a given language, that there's a code that we give a name to, like English or French. We'll come back to that later on Thursday. And when we say rules or regularities, we're not talking about an imposed rule. We're talking about what people actually do. There's a very important difference between the regularities of nature and the regularities in human affairs. But this distinction is not a simple distinction. Linguists often pretend it is, and we're going to go along with that pretense today, and we're going to question it the next day. But for today, let's just say the law of gravity is a great example of natural law, and when Newton came up with the law of gravity, he wasn't telling planets what to do and what not to do. That's not how you do science like that. You don't do physics by telling things what to do. You don't do chemistry by telling chemicals what to do. You observe what they do and you draw your inferences from that. So linguists are not grammar Nazis. Their job is not to go around telling people what to do, not to split infinitives, how to create sentences. That was the role of something called grammar in school. When you were learning your French grammar or your German grammar, you were told, use this rule, don't do it like this, do it like this. That's prescriptive. And this is the big distinction that linguists cling to, because they're often mistaken for grammar Nazis, for people who are telling people what to do. A prescriptive approach lays down the law. Human laws are prescriptive. The law that says, thou shalt not smoke weed, is a prescriptive law, and it could be changed tomorrow. The law of gravity cannot be changed tomorrow. It's descriptive. It's an account to describe regularities observed in the world. Linguists see themselves as scientists who approach human language behavior in order to understand it, to characterize it, and describe it, not to prescribe it. It's not linguists' job to prescribe what to do. Now, generative linguistics has been through many changes since its origins in the 1950s. It originally called itself transformational grammar. And that gave rise to a bunch of intellectual activity that kept changing and changing and changing. We're just going to visit one recent variant of generative syntax, which builds on the idea that languages do not vary arbitrarily. So when we note that a child learns a language, the ambient language, very, very quickly, what we're doing is we're saying the child is sensitive to the fact that languages are expected to conform to certain kinds of regularities. All languages display certain regularities. Languages differ, but they differ in principled ways. So there are some underlying principles that all languages will follow. And the child's task then is not to learn from scratch, but to find out which parameters are set for the language that people are speaking around him or her. So the principles are presumed in this theory to be built in, part of what we call universal grammar, and the child will be born with these. They must be somehow instantiated in the brain or in the meat or something. It's hard to know where. The fact that languages do not vary arbitrarily is illustrated very clearly by the difficulty of constructing an artificial language. You need linguists if you're going to create an artificial language. One of the first ones that was created was Esperanto. There's been several attempts to generate a new language from scratch. Klingon is a reasonably successful one that has been worked out over many years. Can you think of any other artificial languages? Nobody watch Game of Thrones? Dothraki and all kinds of things. Also in Lord of the Rings, the Elvish, and in Avatar, the Na'vi. Hollywood producers love artificial languages, and they always go to MIT, to Boston, to the linguists to get them to design. Maybe they might hire linguists from elsewhere, but you need linguists to design a language. Otherwise you're going to come up with gobbledygook. An example of the kind of principle that children are assumed to know is that a language will have an ability to express very simple relationships between subjects and objects, or agents and patients, or actors and things acted on. So if I say, John kicked the ball, the kind of sentence that generative grammarians love, we don't care who John is, we don't care why he kicked the ball, but John kicked the ball, has a subject, John, and then there follows a verb which says what's going to go on, and then there follows the object, what is the kicking done to. And every language can construct simple sentences like this, but that order of subject, verb, object is only found in about 40 to 45% of the world's languages, English being one of them. If you go to Irish, you find a different canonical order. In Irish, we get the verb first, then the subject, then the object. It may aron, eat I bread, illustrates a different ordering, and this ordering, verb, subject, object, is found in about 5% of the world's languages. So we call Irish a VSO language, and we call English an SVO language. One reason Yoda's language sounds so funny is that he messes with precisely this characteristic of English. He uses a non-canonical word order. He's not particularly consistent, but much to learn you still have. Reorganizes stuff so the stuff that normally comes later is positioned earlier in the sentence. Yoda sounds weird because he's violating this particular organizing principle of English. Now the idea here is that if you're a child growing up, you don't have to learn everything from scratch. You're born expecting simple sentences, and you do have to find out which is the order. Is it going to be verb, subject, object, or subject, verb, object? That's a theoretical position adopted by generative grammarians, and it should be possible to test this and to find out if this is a good description. But it's part and parcel of the idea that children are basically born ready to suck up the language around them and to speak it. And what they're actually doing is just flipping a few switches to make it clear that, I'm learning that kind of language and not that kind of language. And this is why, at a very early age, it's easy to learn a language, and later on, all your switches are set. Now you've got a monumental task when you go to learn a new language at your age. You've already set all those switches, and the task is completely different now when you go to learn a language at a high old age. That's the idea of universal grammar and the principles and parameters approach to syntax. Right, we've gone through pragmatics, which was very much in the real world. And then we had the abstraction of semantics. And we've had the abstraction of syntax, where we even left behind the notion of meaning. Let's abstract a little more and leave behind the notion of words. It might seem obvious to you that words are the basic building blocks of language. But remember, you're coming at this as, first of all, an English speaker. You may speak other languages, but you do speak English. And you're literate. And in writing, it's very clear what the borders between words are, in English at least, because we put spaces between them. We didn't used to. Writing didn't always start off. Spaces were a later addition to writing. And when you put spaces in the text that you're writing, you make it clear where word boundaries are. In spoken language, it's not always clear where word boundaries are. And we see this very dramatically if we go to a language like German, where word formation is much freer than it is in English. In German, it's quite easy to string together pieces to make entirely novel words in a way that we just don't do in English. So this means that it's not words that are the basic constituents of sentences. It's a different unit. The smallest meaningful unit in a language is called a morpheme. And that gives us the domain of morphology. This is really the business of word formation, or if you like, if you're dealing with a language where you're not sure where the word is, this is the raw material of syntax. So a morpheme is the smallest unit which has some independent meaning. So take the word dog in English. Now the word dog has one meaning. It's that animal with the 4 legs. You all know what a dog is. And we can't split that word up into meaningful units. We can split it up into constituent sounds, but those sounds do not themselves mean anything. The word dogs, on the other hand, has 2 parts, which are both meaningful. It has dog, and it has the plural marker. That means there's more than one. So dogs is one word, but 2 morphemes. The word doubtful is likewise 2 morphemes, and you're familiar with them both. Doubt is a perfectly good word on its own, but it can be combined with full. Now, full doesn't stand on its own, but you're familiar with this morpheme from other words such as wonderful, right? Or fanciful. Cranberry illustrates something similar. The word berry is a perfectly good word on its own and is found productively in raspberry and blueberry and mulberry and so on. But cran? Cran is a kind of an odd morpheme. It only occurs in this one form, cranberry. So we say cran is a bound morpheme. It means it's not free to just occur on its own like doubt is. And morphologists study the principles of word formation. Now, are there any German speakers in the audience? Go ahead, hands up who speaks German. Not one person speaks German. I made up this word. This is a nonsense word in German. Straßenbahnritzen Neinemacher Werkzeug Kassenschloss. You can do that. It's not a word anybody's ever going to use. It means the lock on the tool chest that's used for cleaning the gaps in the tram lines. Hugely useful word. Committed to memory, because when you go over to Germany, I'm sure it's the first thing you're going to be asked. No, it's an utterly useless word, but you can do this in German. You can sling together things, and you could express the same thing in English. I just did. But I used multiple words, and I would write them with spaces. But you can see that German words sometimes get quite astonishingly long. They don't have spaces. So the notion of a word is kind of a language-specific construct. It's tied closely with questions of writing and literacy. And when we go below the word, we haven't lost contact with meaning. We still have the level of the morpheme, which is the smallest meaningful unit. Now, there's a field known as psycholinguistics, where psychologists ask themselves, what do you know when you know a language? Well, if you know all the words, did you learn each word as a separate entity? Or have you learnt morphemes and learned how to combine them in different ways? So you know the word dog, and you know how to form a plural. When you say the word dogs, are you drawing on your ability to construct complex objects? Or did you actually know the word dogs as a separate lexical entry, as a separate dictionary entry? That's the kind of concern that you find in the discipline of psycholinguistics. And they're crucially interested in morphemes and words and their relationships. And there's a whole bunch of concerns that come together here. We've just noted that none of these topics are free of the influence of writing. And writing, as we'll explore in the next lecture, is quite a recent innovation in history. So I'm going to wrap up today with just an example. We're going to finish up the morphology, and we'll start the next day with phonology, which is still in generative linguistics, in this abstract domain. I just want to show you that although this looks to be dry as dust, morphology can actually be a bit of fun. And there are tools you can use for studying word structure. So a morphologist is necessarily interested in the internal structure of word, like cranberry or doubtful. So let's just take a word like fantastic. What are the parts to fantastic? We've got 3 syllables. Everyone would say that there's 3 syllables, fantastic. So that's 2 joins, as it were. There's the place where the first syllable meets the second syllable, and the place where the second syllable meets the third syllable. Is fantastic just a sequence of 3 syllables, or does it have some kind of internal structure? And we're going to use a tool called expletive infixation, and if you're of a delicate constitution, please cover your ears because I'm going to curse. Okay? For science. So we're going to try put the word fucking in there. Okay? Fan-fucking-tastic. Fantas-fucking-stick. The first one worked. Fan-fucking-tastic is actually used. It doesn't work in the second position. It doesn't, you just can't say that. And you know that as a native speaker of the language. So even though you may not have 6 years of training in morphology, expletive infixation is a scientific tool for probing the internal structure of words. And we just demonstrated that the word fantastic has a structural difference between the two joins, between the first and second syllable and the second and third syllable. So it's not all dry as dust. We'll stop there. Next day we're going to pick up on the sound branch of generative linguistics, which is phonology, and we'll relate it to phonetics, which also deals with sound, but in a radically different way. Okay? So we carry on Thursday.